Today the Anglo List would like to welcome Advocate Boaz Gork. Advocate Gork is a leading law practitioner and he specializes in family law and divorce. Today he'll be answering some very important questions on the subject relating to marriage, divorce, etc. in Israel. Boaz, it's a pleasure to meet with you today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Suzanne. Yes, I graduated from Bar Ilan University in 1995. I was born in South Africa. I made Aliyah at the age of 9 in 1976, and I've lived most of my life here in Israel. My law firm specializes in family law. We have offices in Jerusalem and in Modi'in.
Okay.
Among other, we also give services to our clients in Tel Aviv.
Boaz, what sets you apart from other family law practitioners?
Well, thank you so much for that question, Suzanne. If I may answer by way of an example, a while ago a client came to me, who I've been representing for the last year and a half or so. When the client first came to me, he was very, very run down, and I saw the immense change of him in the last year or so. He became more confident. Most of the goals which he accepted to achieve during the process were achieved, and now he's much more content. He found his inner voice and his way to achieve what he wants throughout the divorce process. I felt that in my last meeting with this client, and I know that is what makes me different from most other lawyers in this profession. I help my clients find their inner voice. Besides the practice in divorce and the knowledge of the law of divorce, it's also that emotional guidance throughout the process, so that my client will feel his new strength to start again after this process, which is usually so hard and takes away so much of us. And I think that's what makes me a bit different from other people who practice law, especially divorce law.
And of course, you're a native English speaker and a native Hebrew speaker.
Yes, of course, Suzanne. That of course goes without saying. I was born, of course, as I mentioned, in South Africa. I speak fluent English. I represent most of my clients, or Anglo clients, people who all made Aliyah or have been living in Israel for a while. Also clients from abroad. I speak fluent English as well as fluent Hebrew. So
Okay.
I'm very much aware of the Israeli legal system and how to get the most out of it. And also I am aware of the special needs of the Anglo community, especially here in Israel.
Okay. Boaz, when we talk about family law in Israel, what exactly does that encompass?
Well, family law covers relationship within the family, resolving family disputes, separation and divorce, the rights of children and custody, maintenance and abduction issues, the rights and protection of the spouses before and after the divorce, prenuptial and separation agreements, protecting assets, family violence, and also everything concerning inheritance, wills, and so on and so forth, rights after death. Yes,
Okay.
there is a family also after death.
Especially in Israel, being a Jewish country, we hear a lot about the Rabbinical Court. We also hear about the civil courts.
Yeah.
Can you explain to us briefly what is the difference between the Rabbinical Court and what is the civil court? How does it work?
Well, Suzanne, in Israel, which in this issue, there's a big difference between how it works in Israel and how it works in any other country in the world. Whereas in every other country, most Western countries, there is one court or instance who resolves divorce issues, and that is usually and mostly the family court. In Israel, the same issues concerning divorce could come before the Rabbinical Court or the family court.
Okay.
And the point is that the spouse who served the divorce papers before to the first instance, well, that instance will receive jurisdiction.
So I can choose which court I want to be represented in?
Yes, that is correct. That is actually the situation here in Israel, which is quite different and in a way we have to get used to it. The person who goes first and initiates the divorce first, in that court there will be the jurisdiction. So if you, for instance, Suzanne, decide to partake your divorce, and you just to the Rabbinical Court,
yes.
and you go there before your husband goes
yes.
to the family court,
okay.
the Rabbinical Court will have jurisdiction.
Okay.
And that is a big difference between Israel and any other country in the Western world.
But is the Rabbinical Court governed by the family court in any way?
Yes, well, there's a very big friction between the Rabbinical Court and the family court. Basically, about 8 to 10 years ago, the Rabbinical Court had their own set of laws according to what they decide. A main and most common example is that a woman who committed adultery in a Rabbinical court would lose all her financial rights, whereas the family court, this is unheard of. Okay. But there has been a new decision by the Supreme Court about 13 years ago, which made a big change in this matter and deliberated that the Rabbinical Court are also have to practice according to the civil law. So also if a divorce is presented to the Rabbinical Court, they are subdue to the civil laws. So actually, in practice, the rabbis have to go and decide according to civil law.
Okay.
So when it comes to the law which applies in the Rabbinical Court, in practice it is the same law.
Okay. What if I'm a non-Jew and I live in Israel?
Yes.
Who
do you refer to?
Yeah.
Yes.
Does the Rabbinical Court, do they play any part in my life, in my divorce proceedings?
Yes. Well, if you are not Jewish, according to the law, the Rabbinical Court plays no part in your divorce, and there is only one jurisdiction for resolving issues of separation among non-Jews, and that is the family court. If you want to divorce, you will file for divorce only in the family court, and there is no possibility to revert to the Rabbinical Court.
Does the Rabbinical Court play any part in division of our assets as a family, as a couple, or is that just governed by civil?
Well, as I said, if you refer your case to the Rabbinical Court before your spouse goes to the family court, then the Rabbinical Court will decide how to split the assets.
Okay.
Despite this, they are under the ruling of the civil law. So the Rabbinical Court has to make its decisions according to civil law.
Okay.
But, and here it's important to emphasize, the people sitting in the Rabbinical Court are not like the judges in the family court. Whereas the judges have usually secular education, the rabbis learned in a yeshiva, they learned in religious yeshivot. So despite they are forced to decide according to the civil law, they are obliged to it, they find their own way of interpreting it. So there may be very many differences, and it may, in many cases, the ruling of the Rabbinical Court and of the family court in the same issue, in the same matter.
Okay. So Boaz, let's assume that I want to get divorced. Do I need a lawyer to represent me, or is there some way I can represent myself?
I would never suggest a person to represent himself in a divorce case. Divorce and the divorce agreement encompasses our whole life in the future in separation from our spouse. I think either way, whether it is done through negotiation and agreement, and whether the judgment is made through the court, it is always important to be represented so that a person who is an expert in family law will know what is important for the rest of your life and how to protect those rights.
Very interesting. Okay, getting back to this topic. I come to you, I talk to you, you're a fellow English speaker, I feel confident to work with you, and I choose you to represent me in my divorce. So some very basic questions. How much does it actually cost to get divorced? You hear people saying, oh my God, it cost me so much, I'll be miserable for the rest of my life because I can't afford it. How do lawyers set their fees? Does the Law Society dictate what the fees are? How does it work?
Well, Suzanne, there is no exact question exact answer to that question. But what is important for me, you must never, I think a person must never accept the fact that he has to be miserable for the rest of his life.
Okay.
There is no money in the world which would make it worth your while to be miserable for the rest of your life.
Okay, maybe just a lot of bad jokes on that topic.
The most important thing is for you to be happy and to be content.
Okay.
And if something is needed, and then I'm going back to what I said before, it's just like an operation. If an operation costs a certain amount of money, but you have to do it, there is no other way. You can't say I will not have this operation and I'll die.
Okay.
I mean, let's put it this way.
That's a good example.
So there is no choice.
Okay.
If there is no choice, it's always important to be very careful before we make a decision. But once we decide that there is no other way, then it's not that this is an option. We have to do this.
I understand. So do lawyers charge per hour, per case, per a flat rate? Just sort of...
Yes, well, each lawyer has his own way of charging for a divorce case, and there is no laws which abide us as lawyers in whole or as family lawyers in specific. So the market is quite open in that field. Each one has his own way. I will tell you a bit about the way I price a case, which is a bit different from my colleagues. I do not charge by hour or by hearings in court or by the amount of meetings I have with my client or so on and so forth. The way I charge for a divorce case would be the outcome. If a client would come to me for a separation agreement, I charge one rate for the whole...
A flat rate.
A flat rate, that is the way you call it here in Israel,
or
in America.
Okay.
A flat rate for my service from the beginning to the end, where I have in my eyes and in my mind to get to the best agreement I can for my client. Now, if to reach this agreement will take one hearing or 10 hearings, it makes absolutely no difference. I want my client to get the best possible agreement. And for that, there is one rate.
Okay, I understand.
That's the way I work it.
Okay. I suppose there are some lawyers perhaps that charge a percentage of the assets or
Yes, well, there's all kinds and different variations of the way lawyers charge and inheritance.
Okay. So there could be a number of options. You need to clarify with your lawyer how he's going to charge you, what your work agreement is. I suppose you should have that in writing.
Correct.
It should be clearly outlined what his obligation is and what your obligations are.
That is correct.
Okay.
That is correct.
What are the first steps? What will my divorce agreement cover?
Well, there are 4 main issues, actually maybe 5 in a divorce agreement. One is the agreement to actually separate and divorce. The agreement to separate from each other, that each one would start his own way of life, not together but separate. It's actually the agreement of starting on a new way of life, on taking the next step.
We acknowledge that this is no longer working and...
Exactly. So the first part of any divorce agreement would be this acknowledgement.
Okay.
And among this acknowledgement would be going to the Rabbinical Court to do the halachic get, what is called. A get is the halachic terminology for divorce. That
Okay,
is that
and halachic means according to
the Jewish law. Yes. Despite the fact, it's important to emphasize also on this point, that despite the fact that the divorce can be deliberated also in the family court, as I mentioned before, the actual ceremony of the get, which is the legal Hebrew divorce, has to always be done in the Rabbinical Court.
Okay.
Thus, part of the divorce agreement, the first part would be that you are both going to go together to the Rabbinical Court to do the ceremony of the get.
Understand.
That is usually the first part.
Okay.
Another outcome of this agreement would be the issue that the wife does not have any claims for her ketubah. The ketubah is also a halachic terminology.
The ketubah is the religious marriage agreement.
Exactly.
That's in addition to your civil marriage license.
Exactly. Correct. In Israel or or all over the world.
Any Jewish marriage.
Any Jewish marriage, that is correct. When the couple stand together under the chuppah, the husband signs a document. Usually people don't take it too seriously and just see it as part of the ceremony.
Something you hang up on your wall.
Something you hang up on your wall, but really that document has very much meaning and is very significant.
Okay.
The issues which are in the divorce agreement is one, of course, as I mentioned, the divorce itself, the ketubah. Another issue is the issue of custody. Who will have the custody of children after separation or divorce? Visitation rights for the parent who is not the custodian. Child support or maintenance for the wife after divorce. The issue of separation of assets. How the assets will be separated after the divorce, and the issue of no further claims, the closure of claims from each other, that you are starting now a new life without any previous claims.
So Boaz, if there are just 4 topics that need to be addressed in a divorce settlement, why is it sometimes so complicated, and why does it sometimes take so much time to come to an agreement?
The reason which usually takes so much time is that despite it seems that there's only 4, usually one or more of these issues are in dispute.
Okay.
For instance, the couple might agree on how to separate the assets or how much child support to be paid, but there is a big disputation on the issue of custody.
Okay.
It could be that there is a big disputation on the issue of separation of assets. If one or more of these issues are in dispute, this causes the spouses to meet in court.
Okay. And this is what causes the delay in reaching a final agreement.
That is correct. I would like to point out at this stage that many times both lawyers sit together and manage to reach an agreement which would encompass the needs of their own client, and to get their best interest without deliberating in court, and thus there is needed only one meeting in court for the authorization of the agreement.
I understand.
No else.
What does a lawyer need from the client in order to initiate the divorce proceedings? What documentation would I need to provide? How I come to you and I say to you, I'm getting divorced, Boaz, and you say to me, okay, I need you to get this information for me.
Well, here it's important for me to emphasize when I meet a client or somebody who tells me about his need to separate from his spouse, I don't really, the more important thing for me is to talk to him, to hear his needs, not papers. I want to hear what my client or potential client needs. What does he expect to get out of this divorce? It's much more important to know the needs of the client than what paper if he has to bring to the next meeting. So it's
but
much
for
more
instance, wouldn't it, sorry to interrupt, important for you to know what the assets of the family are? Surely I would have to show you and prove to you that my spouse is worth $1 million and I deserve half.
Well, if you say your spouse is worth $1 million, I'll take it
Whatever.
for your word. I mean, if you say so.
I mean, there might be an instance where a spouse is hiding his assets.
Yes. Well, first of all, as I mentioned, the most important thing, and this also is for me a bit different than my colleagues, I don't immediately come and ask for papers.
Okay.
Once I know what my client needs, I already will know how to get it.
I understand.
For instance, if the most important thing for you is to get a bigger bulk out of the assets, or if that is the main issue, I will know how to get it. Now, how will I get it? That's my problem.
Okay.
You don't have to worry.
Okay.
If I will see there's a possibility for you to get these documents from your husband or in some kind of way, that would be great. But if you won't, it's my task to get this information. And I have ways, through the court, through the legal system, to get every information I need so I can promote your special needs in the divorce.
I understand. Boaz, what about, I'm in this like hugely emotional place, you know, talking to my sister, talking to my mother. Should I tell my husband that I'm going to divorce him?
Well,
what would you advise?
I would definitely think that in the case of separation, discretion is very, very important. Due to the fact that, especially in the system here in Israel, where there is also the Rabbinical Court and the Family Court, as I mentioned before, once the spouse hears that you want to separate from him, he might go to the Rabbinical Court and initiate something which might harm you.
I understand.
Also, he might do things concerning the assets, which will make it very harder in the future to get what you deserve. I would be cautious on this matter. Of course, initially, when what usually happens in my experience, when one of the spouses decides to separate or divorce, then they will hint or tell. But usually, the husband or the wife hears it as a kind of idea, not specific.
Okay. Yeah.
When it comes to the specific, and you have made a decision, you've made a specific decision to divorce, I would keep that quiet. I would talk to a close friend. I think it's very important to have friends in this issue, because the process is not easy.
And have emotional support.
And it's important to have emotional support. But at the first stage, I wouldn't advise to tell my husband or wife, according to the circumstances, my plans in the future.
I understand. Okay, that's very interesting. So, Boaz, we've spoken about quite a number of important issues so far, but there are a few more I'd like to discuss with you. Let's talk now about infidelity and the rights of the wronged spouse in infidelity cases.
Mm-hmm.
Does the Rabbinical Court have its own definition of infidelity, or is there one definition of infidelity? Is it the same in the Rabbinical Court or in the Civil Court? What is the definition of infidelity?
Wow, so much questions, Suzanne. Well, I'll try to relate to these these issues which you pointed out.
Okay.
First of all, it's an important thing, because marriage is actually known as something to be monogamous. As far as we know it, a person has to be loyal to his spouse or her spouse for the rest of their life. That is a basic part of marriage.
So, on an emotional level, he has to be loyal, and on a physical level.
Yeah, yes.
So, there are two kinds of infidelity.
Yes, well, that's interesting, because infidelity is a very subjective thing. Okay. Unfaithfulness is very subjective. What one person would seem as being unfaithful, for another person would seem quite normal. Like, for instance, in the eyes of one spouse, a woman or a husband, if the husband is not attentive to her emotional needs, that's infidelity. If a husband is gives emotion to another woman, that would be infidelity. If a husband would write on the Facebook or chat on the Facebook with somebody else, that would be concerning being unfaithful. On the other hand, there are other couples who would pay no attention to this. On the other hand, sexual
Physical infidelity.
or physical relationship with somebody else would be considered infidelity. I have to also point out the fact that today, and also from my experience, many couples also accept the fact of an open marriage. The wife accepts the fact that the husband has a sexual relationship with someone else out of the marriage, and also the opposite. Today's society is changing its views towards infidelity.
Okay.
Whereas society is changing its views, the law is quite different. The law has still not changed and adapted to itself exactly to the different variations of infidelity.
Okay.
So, how would this affect the marriage if someone was unfaithful? I have to point out that, again, till about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a big difference in this matter between the Rabbinical Court and the Family Court. In the Family Court, if one of the spouses was having a sexual relationship with someone else, or being unfaithful in any other way, there would be no consequences. Whereas in the Rabbinical Court, they would see it as a very, very severe thing. There have been times where the Rabbinical Court decided that a wife loses a serious part of the mutual assets which were accomplished during marriage, which were accumulated during marriage, because of her being unfaithful.
Okay.
But again, lately things have changed. In 2008, the Supreme Court ruled that the Rabbinical Court have no discretion to take away initial rights of the woman in the property because of her being unfaithful. So basically now, the woman who is unfaithful, it has no implication to her rights in the assets. Even if a woman was having sex with another man out of the marriage, she would be entitled to half the assets which were accumulated during the marriage, despite the fact of her unfaithfulness. And the Rabbinical Court also are obliged to decide in this way, even though it is against the halachic rule. The Rabbinical Court are abided by the civil law, and they cannot take rights from the woman who is unfaithful. The same going for the man.
What are the rights of the physically or emotionally abused spouse, or emotionally or physically abused children? What rights do they have?
Well, they have a right not to be abused.
Obviously.
Yes. Well,
so the right to safety.
The right to safety. Well, this is the important issue is to mention. The right of every person under the law is to live safely and to live without being scared from his wife or her husband, or when it comes to children, definitely there is no tolerance to violence.
Okay.
The issue becomes more relevant in the case of a marriage, because here we are with the same person 24 hours a day. And I don't think there could be anything worse than living with a violent man or a violent woman.
Okay.
Violence is not necessarily physical violence. Violence could also be humiliation,
Emotional abuse.
emotional abuse, as you put it very nicely. If a man calls the wife in names, curses her, says she's worthless, gives her that feeling for that ongoing feeling. Also the opposite.
So, sorry to interrupt you. So, as a wife, how can I protect myself if my husband is violent towards me? Is there some way that I can keep him away from me? Can I get a restraining order?
Yes. Well, there is already quite an ancient law here in Israel, which is called the law against domestic violence, a specific law concerning domestic violence. This law orders that immediately when any kind of violence, also emotional violence on a high level, or of course physical violence, the spouse can ex parte immediately go to the court and receive a restrainment order without any procedure. Theoretically without even legal counsel, even though I always advise people to take legal counsel. She has to fill in a few very, very basic forms and go with these forms to the secretary of the court, and she will be immediately brought in front of a judge. And the judge ex parte, if the judge hears, according to her story, that this is a case of domestic violence, will order the husband out of the house, even before hearing his side. The judge is obliged to set a date for a hearing with both sides, a week at most from when he made that decision. But the procedure is made very, very simple for the spouse who is suffering from the domestic violence. It's a matter of quite immediate. So thus, if, and it's my advice to any person who suffers violence, not to wait. First of all, call the police immediately. And the second, with this complaint, to go to the secretary of the court and apply immediately for a restrainment order against the violent spouse.
Excellent advice. We spoke previously about the ketubah. I just would like to go back there for a minute. How different is the ketubah to a prenuptial agreement? Is there overlap? Are they similar?
Well, the ketubah is it's very different. And let me say they might even be opposites.
Okay.
Whereas a prenuptial agreement is agreement under civil law, that the spouses agree that they're not in community of property and not obliged to each other, and each one usually remains with what he brought to the marriage. It's a matter of relievement of obligations. The ketubah is a matter of taking upon obligations, and one-sided obligations. The ketubah is a document which the man signs under the chuppah when he gets married, in which only he obliges himself to his wife. There is no mutual
obligations
of the wife to the husband. This comes from actually older ideas, more ancient ideas, that when we get married, the husband has to take care of the wife. There is no obligation of her to him. He is obliged to her. And in that document concerned the ketubah, we oblige ourselves to take care of our wife, to pay for her for all her needs, medication, clothing, to see that she looks nice, to take care of her happiness. And among others, we oblige ourselves to a very, very high sum if we decide for any kind of stupid reason to let her go. And that is the essence of the ketubah, which is quite a major document, which is done every Jewish couple signs the ketubah when they get married.
Okay.
About 15 years ago, when I started practicing family law, I represented a client and he mentioned the issue of the ketubah, and I thought to myself, what is this guy talking about? This is some ritual, nothing. And really then it meant nothing. But in the last 10 to 12 years, it means a lot. The Rabbinical Court put a very, very serious emphasis on the issue of ketubah. And we have been hearing more and more judgments of the Rabbinical Court. If the husband initiates the divorce, that he has to pay her the amount of the ketubah. I have to point out here, it's enough. We don't even have to find any fault in the behavior of the husband. It's enough that the husband initiates the divorce. He decides he cannot live with this woman anymore.
Okay.
When there is no fault on her side, for him to have to pay the amount of the ketubah, which could sometimes reach very, very high amounts.
Okay. Let's go on to a couple who've been living together for a number of years, and legally the wife is considered the common law wife. What are her rights? Does she have the same rights as a wife in a marriage?
Well, actually, a common law wife in law, as it is called, is like is a wife for any purpose, and the same obligations which are to a wife who we married under chuppah and kiddushin, what is known, and the same obligations are to a common law wife, which is actually a woman who we are living with for more than 3 years. The law usually recognizes 6 years as the average period of time when a woman who we are living with together under community of property would be considered a common law wife according to law, and we would be obliged to her like our wife.
So in terms of separation, she's has the same rights.
Correct.
In terms of inheritance, she has the same rights.
Correct.
Okay. Interesting.
The exact rights which relate to an ordinary to a married wife who we married through ketubah and kiddushin are the same rights to a common law wife.
Right.
There is absolutely no difference.
So Boaz, let's talk about the issue of mediation. What is mediation actually? Is mediation geared towards reconciliation? Who acts as a mediator? Is it a necessary part of the divorce process?
Well, a mediation in the issue of divorce is for one specific issue, for reaching a divorce agreement without the need for disputation in court. Mediation is usually done by a lawyer who is a family lawyer who also represents in court, but has done a special practice also in mediation. By the way, I've also practiced this, and I also practice mediation, and it is another way to resolve issues. It is not always appropriate, but in many cases, instead of fighting a long time in court, if there is a basic relationship of trust between the husband and wife, which is quite seldom in divorce cases,
right.
But if that exists, it's possible of resolving the issues with one lawyer who would help the parties reach an agreement without the need for disputation in court.
As you mentioned earlier, if they do reach an agreement, then the only thing that needs to happen is for that agreement to be presented to the judge in the court to authorize it.
That's correct, Suzanne.
Okay.
Once the mediation succeeds, the parties make a divorce agreement, and this divorce agreement goes to the judge, whose only task is to authorize the agreement to see that there is sufficient protection for the children, for their rights, and that the arrangements are reasonable. If he finds out that they are, he will authorize this agreement, and thus the matter and the disputation between the parties will be resolved much easily and with more amicably. That is correct.
Okay. So Boaz, this has been a very, very interesting conversation. I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure that anyone who watches this video will come away with a greater understanding of all aspects of divorce in Israel, spousal rights and children's rights. I thank you very much for your time. And for all people that are watching this video, you'll find more articles written by Boaz on the Anglo list and on his website. His contact information, you'll be able to find it at the end of this video.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. It's been a pleasure being with you today, and I really would like to wish all my viewers and listeners a wonderful day, and really that you will achieve your goals and we will achieve happiness.